Before you hear this story, I want you to say something out loud right now, even if you're alone. I trust the people I love. Say it. Hold it. Because by the end of what I'm about to tell you, that sentence is going to feel different in your mouth. My name is Gordon. I'm 63 years old, and I found out my son-in-law had been listening to my life for 11 days before I even knew it was possible. Not through a phone tap, not through some government program, through a smartwatch, the one he gave me for Christmas. It was sitting right there on my wrist. I live in Sudbury, Ontario, in a house I bought in 1991, when the nickel plant was still running 3 shifts, and you could still afford to be wrong about a few things. The neighborhood has changed. The plant hasn't run 3 shifts in years, but the house is mine, fully paid off, and I'd been working as a senior inspector for the city's building permits office for going on 22 years, the kind of job nobody thinks about until their permit gets delayed. Then they think about it a great deal. My daughter Claire married her husband Theo about 4 years ago. Theo sells commercial real estate in the greater Sudbury area. Handsome, easy to talk to, always knows the score on the Leafs, even when there's no score worth knowing. I liked him. I want to be clear about that, because what I'm about to tell you could make it sound like I never did. I did. I genuinely did. Christmas morning, Theo handed me a box. Inside was a smartwatch, not a cheap one. One of those sleek, matte black things with a health monitoring app, heart rate sensor, sleep tracking, the works. The card said, "For the man who keeps everything running, stay healthy, Dad." He'd started calling me Dad around the 2nd year. I liked that too. I wore it to work the first week back after the holidays, wore it at the office, wore it on site visits, wore it when I walked the dog through Ramsey Lake Trail in the evenings. It felt good, actually, modern, like I was keeping up with something. The colleague who noticed was a woman named Beverly Okonkwo. She runs our department's safety compliance files and used to work in telecommunications before she came to the city, sharp as anything. The kind of person who reads the fine print not because she's paranoid, but because she finds it genuinely interesting. We were in the break room, mid-January. I was showing her the sleep tracker feature, how it had logged that I'd been restless on Thursday, which it had, because the furnace was making a sound it shouldn't. She leaned in, looked at the watch face, then looked at the back, then asked her she could see the box it came in. I still had it in my truck. I don't know why. Old habit. I brought it in. She read something on the inside panel and went quiet in a way that had nothing to do with the room. "Gordon," she said, "this watch is registered." "So?" I said. "They all are." She turned the box around slowly. It was registered under a different name. Not mine. I remember the sound of the coffee maker finishing its cycle, that little hiss and pop. I remember it precisely because it was the last moment before everything changed shape. Bev didn't alarm me. She just said calmly that I should look into it before I dismissed it. She said there were configurations some devices can run that the owner of record would have access to, even remotely. She said she wasn't certain, but she was certain enough to be careful. That afternoon, I drove to the Sudbury Police Service on Brady Street. The waiting area smelled like old carpet and hand sanitizer. A constable named Ibarra came out, maybe 40, the kind of person whose steadiness you feel before they've said a word. I told him what Bev had said. He took the watch, told me to come back in the morning. I drove home slowly. The highway was clear for once, the sky already dark by 4, the way it gets in January up here. I thought about Claire, about Theo bringing that box over on Christmas morning, how he'd made a small ceremony out of it, insisted I open it right then, not after dinner. I thought it was sweetness. I'd laughed and said he was worse than the grandkids. I didn't tell my wife, Doreen, that night. We've been married 31 years. We've been through things. But this was still a shape I didn't have words for yet. I didn't want to hand her a panic I couldn't explain. The next morning, Constable Ibarra brought in a colleague, a woman named Torres, civilian tech staff, mid-30s, the kind of quiet that comes from being the only person in the room who actually understands what she's looking at. She set the watch on the table between us. "Mr. Gordon," she said, This device has been enrolled in a paired account that isn't yours. What does that mean? I asked. It means someone else has remote access, location data, ambient audio pickup. She paused, through the microphone. When the watch is on your wrist. My throat went dry. So, someone could hear me? She didn't answer directly. She asked instead where I'd been wearing it. The answer settled over me the way cold water does. At work, in my truck, in the house, on the phone with my brother Frank about what we were going to do with our parents' property up in Kapuskasing now that the estate was finally closing. About the money I'd set aside since Doreen's knee surgery last spring. About the RRSP I was thinking about converting to a RIF next year. About everything. Don't confront anyone yet, Constable Ibarra said. Act as you normally would. Normal. I drove back to work and spent the afternoon reviewing permit files for a commercial renovation on Lawrence Street and thought about what it means to carry a window into your own life on your wrist without knowing it. That night I put the watch on the kitchen table and looked at it. Small, matte, silent. I thought about Theo's easy smile, about how he always asked thoughtful questions, about finances, about the property, about retirement. I'd thought he was interested. Maybe he was. Just not in the way I'd assumed. I slept about 2 hours. By morning, the fear had compressed itself into something I could carry, something functional. I've worked around infrastructure my whole career, systems that can fail quietly for a long time before anything visible goes wrong. You learn not to panic, you learn to observe. At the office, I went through my day. Bev caught my eye across the room and nodded once, barely perceptible, the way you do when you're both waiting for something and neither of you wants to be the one who tips it. My phone rang at lunch. Unknown number. I stepped into the stairwell. It was Torres. She'd run a deeper check. The account the watch was enrolled to had location history. My home address. My office. The trailhead at Ramsey Lake. A specific coffee shop on Elm Street where I met my financial advisor, Alan Bryce, every few months to review things. She said, whoever set this up wasn't collecting random data. I leaned against the concrete wall of the stairwell. The heating duct above me ticked in the cold. They wanted patterns, she said. Routines, financial conversations, health. Why health? I asked. Another pause. That's the part that concerns us more than the listening. I drove home that evening via the long route, past the old downtown, past the mall. Past the turns I used to take when Claire was young, and I'd drive her to hockey practice in the dark at 5:30 in the morning, and she'd fall asleep against the window with her equipment bag jammed between the seats. I thought about how long it takes to love someone, how quickly it can become the thing they use. At home, Doreen was in the kitchen sorting through mail. She looked tired. I almost told her. The words were right there. Instead, I asked casually whether Theo had called that week. She shook her head. Why? No reason. That night I did something that cost me more than I expected. I put the watch back on. I moved around the house the way I normally would. I talked out loud, the way you do when you live in a place long enough that the rooms feel like company. I said, clearly, that I'd been thinking about updating my power of attorney, that maybe it made sense to have someone involved who understood the financial side of things. I waited. The next morning, Theo texted me, "Just checking in, Dad. Claire mentioned you were thinking about some estate stuff. Would love to help if there's anything I can do on the real estate side." He added a thumbs up emoji. 11 words to confirm what I already knew. I forwarded the message to Ibarra. Over the next few days, I kept building the picture carefully. I mentioned to the empty kitchen that Alan Bryce had suggested I might want to look at transferring the Kapuskasing property sooner rather than later for tax reasons. Within 24 hours, Theo called Claire to suggest a family dinner to talk about the future. Claire told me this, puzzled, because Theo rarely initiated anything that involved actual planning. I kept going. I talked in the car about being tired more often than I used to be, about a spell of dizziness I'd had in November standing up from my desk too fast. Nothing serious. I'd mentioned it to my doctor already. I talked about whether Doreen could manage the house on her own if something happened. I talked about the insurance policy I'd updated the spring before. Each time, something moved. A text. A suggestion. Once, Theo stopped by the house unannounced on a Tuesday evening with a bottle of wine and a casual question about whether we'd ever thought about downsizing. The Sudbury market was strong right now, he said, smiled his easy smile, said he could get us a number. Claire was in the other room. I thanked him and said we weren't there yet. After he left, I sat in the garage for an hour in the cold. I could hear the hockey game through the wall from the living room. Doreen had turned it on for noise. The Leafs were losing, as God apparently intended. I called Bev. Am I reading this wrong? I asked. She didn't hesitate. You're not. The paperwork I found didn't come all at once. It came the way bad news always does, in pieces, when your guard drops just enough. I was looking for the water shut-off schematic for the city. I sometimes bring work files home, old habit, and I went into the filing cabinet in the second bedroom. Second drawer, behind the utility folders. A folder I didn't recognize. Cream-colored, new, the kind of folder that has no business being in a drawer that hasn't been touched since 2019. Inside was a printed document, legal language. Not a lawyer's letterhead, but formatted to look close. The language mentioned personal care decisions, financial management, capacity concerns, continuing power of attorney. There were handwritten notes in the margin, in Theo's handwriting, which I recognized from contractor invoices he'd once helped me organize. Short phrases, mentions of the dizziness in November, a note about the Kapuskasing property, a note that said, confirm insurance policy beneficiary. I sat on the floor of the second bedroom for a long time. This wasn't about stealing a number or getting a commission on a sale. This was about replacing me, legally, quietly, with forms and a narrative and audio clips pulled from a device on my own wrist. I thought about how many conversations I'd had in those 11 days, about health, about money, about the property, about feeling older, how easy it would be to stitch those fragments into a story about a man losing his capacity to manage his own affairs. How easy, if you had the right recordings and the right paperwork and a judge who didn't know me from anyone. I put the folder back exactly as I found it, took photos on my phone, sent them to Ibarra. The next morning, before work, I called our family lawyer, Sandra Pete, at her office on Durham Street. I told her everything. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she said, "This is not the first call like this I've received." She told me to update my will, update the power of attorney, ensure Doreen and I had each other properly designated, ensure no secondary designation existed that I hadn't authorized. She said get everything signed and witnessed in the next 72 hours. She said, don't tell Theo. The hardest part of the next week wasn't the waiting, it was watching Claire. She'd come over for Sunday dinner the way she usually did, and she'd seem herself. Warm, distracted by her own week, asking Doreen about her physiotherapy. She didn't know. I was certain of that. Whatever Theo had been building, he'd built it without her. The thought made it both easier and harder to sit across from her over chicken and rice and say nothing. Twice I nearly said something. Once when she laughed at a joke her father made and reached across the table and squeezed my arm the way she's done since she was 7 years old. Once when she mentioned, casually, that Theo had been stressed lately. Work stuff, she said. She didn't elaborate. I nodded and passed the bread. On Thursday, Ibarra called. They had enough. He outlined what they'd found, the watch enrolled into Theo's account, the audio activity log showing remote access on 14 separate occasions, the fraudulent queries made to 2 financial institutions in the previous 6 weeks on my behalf without authorization. Someone had called my bank. Someone had called the insurance company. They'd represented themselves as acting with my knowledge. They had not. Ibarra said the next step was a meeting. Not dramatic, just formal. My lawyer, a financial crimes investigator from the OPP's unit in Sudbury, Doreen, if I wanted her present, and Theo. I called Sandra Pete. She said she'd arrange it. I didn't sleep well the night before. Not from fear, but from the particular weight of knowing that something has to crack, and that cracking changes the shape of everything afterward. I told Doreen that morning, over coffee, before anyone else was awake. I took my time. I laid it out clearly. She was quiet for a long while. When she spoke, she asked only one question. "Does Claire know?" "No," I said. She nodded. We sat with that. The meeting was at Sandra Pete's office downtown. A boardroom with a long table and tall windows looking out onto Durham Street, the snow still gray against the curb from the last storm. Theo came in wearing a good coat and his work face, the one that was warm and slightly amused, the one that had always read to me as confidence and now read differently. He looked at Sandra. He looked at the OPP investigator, Constable Desforges, a quiet man in plainclothes who'd said almost nothing since arriving. He looked at me last. He didn't sit down right away. Sandra opened a folder. She placed a printed sheet in front of him, the registration information for the watch, then the access logs, then the call records from both financial institutions. Theo's expression shifted in a way that was small but unmistakable, like a door closing behind someone. "I was trying to help," he said. "Gordon's been talking about estate planning for years. Someone has to take initiative." Constable Desforges set a small recorder on the table. He pressed a button. My own voice filled the room, slightly hollow, the ambient noise of my kitchen, talking about the property and the insurance and the dizziness in November. Theo stared at the recorder. "Where did you get that?" Desforges said, "From the device you registered in your name." Theo turned to me. He tried to smile once. It didn't hold. "I wasn't trying to hurt anyone," he said. "You're getting older. Someone needs to think ahead." Getting older. I was 63 years old. I'd been running city building inspections for 22 years. I'd raised a daughter and maintained a marriage and kept a house standing through 4 decades of Sudbury winters. I looked at him across that table and felt something that wasn't quite anger. Steadier than anger. The kind of feeling you get when a system you've been watching for a long time finally shows you exactly what it was doing. Sanders slid another document forward. The folder I'd found in the filing cabinet, photocopied, each margin note clearly legible. Theo's jaw tightened. "This matter is being referred for investigation," Sanders said. "Any communication to Mr. Gordon, Mrs. Gordon, or their financial representatives outside of legal counsel will be treated as interference." Desforges stood. He asked Theo to come with him. Theo stood very still for a moment. Then he looked at me. "You did this," he said. "It was supposed to be simple." I looked back at him. I kept my voice quiet. "It never was," I said. He left. The door closed. The room felt like it was still adjusting to the absence of sound. I sat there for another minute. The watch was on the table in an evidence sleeve. I looked at it once. Matte black, precise, honest in its way, now that the question had been answered. Sandra put her hand briefly on the file and said she'd be in touch. Outside on Durham Street, the January cold was clean and direct. I stood on the pavement for a moment and breathed it in, the kind of cold that makes the edges of things sharp and specific. Then I got in my truck and drove home. Claire came over 2 nights later. She knew. Theo had called her from wherever he was. She stood at the front door for a long moment before Doreen brought her inside. We sat in the kitchen, the 3 of us, with the light on over the table the way it has been since Claire was small. She cried, not the loud kind, the kind that comes from somewhere deeper than emotion, the place where you keep the things you trusted without question. I didn't rush anything. I didn't explain it again. I just sat with her the way I'd sat with her through other hard things, because that's what you do when someone is trying to find their footing and the best thing you can offer is stillness. She said, "I didn't know." "I know," I said. She said, "I'm sorry." I let that sit for a moment, not to make her carry it longer than she needed to, but because it deserved to be received properly. "I believe you," I said, and I meant it. The following weeks moved at the particular pace of things that are serious and slow, Sandra handled the legal side. I met with Alan Bryce and went through the accounts, changed what needed to be changed, confirmed what was properly documented. I called my brother Frank and explained the situation. He was quiet on the phone for a long while and then said, "You know what you should have done with that watch?" I said, "What?" He said, "Left it on a park bench." I laughed. First real one in weeks. At work, Bev asked once if things had resolved. I said, "Getting there." She nodded and didn't push. That was the right call. That was Bev. Doreen and I talked about things the way we do, in pieces, over the ordinary movements of the day. She said once that she'd felt something was off for a while, not with me, with the situation. A low-level unease she hadn't had a name for. I told her I wished I'd said something sooner. She said she probably would have worried too much, and then we would have talked ourselves out of it. That sounded right. I stopped wearing the smartwatch. I went back to the old analog one I'd had since my father gave it to me in 1998. It runs about 3 minutes fast, and I've never fixed it, because there's something I've always liked about being slightly ahead of time rather than precisely on it. Late at night, when the house is quiet and the furnace is doing its thing, I still think about how close it came to going the other way. One signature, one appointment I'd agreed to attend without knowing what it was for, one moment of not questioning a gift that arrived with a good card and a genuine-looking smile. That's what stays, not the paperwork, not the investigation, the ease of it. How naturally the trap was shaped around the contours of a normal life, fitted to the things a person says when they think no one is listening. Their worries, their plans, their small admissions of slowing down. I used to think trust was something you gave consciously, that you made a decision, weighed it, and handed it over deliberately. What I learned at 63 is that most trust is given in the spaces between decisions, in the things you say out loud in your own kitchen, in the watch you put on every morning because someone who called you dad handed it to you on Christmas Day with a smile that cost him nothing to make. So here is what I'll leave you with. Ask questions about what you carry, about what's registered in your name and what isn't, about who benefits from a story of your decline and when they started telling it. Talk to a lawyer before you think you need one. Update your documents before you feel the urgency. And when someone offers to help manage your affairs, ask them plainly, help them toward what? Protecting yourself is not suspicion. It is respect for everything you've spent a life building. And if this story reminded you of something or someone, don't keep it to yourself. These things survive in silence. They come apart in light. Thank you for being here with me today. Don't forget to subscribe to Voices of Uncle Edgar and share this with someone who needs to hear it. There's a moment I keep coming back to, not the meeting at Sandra's office, not the moment Theo's composure cracked, the moment I sat on the floor of the second bedroom, holding that cream-colored folder, reading his handwriting in the margins. Confirm insurance policy beneficiary. That's the line that stays with me. Not because it frightened me, though it did, because it showed me how clearly he had thought it through, how long he must have been thinking it through, and how little he imagined I would. That's the part I have to sit with honestly. I had trusted without asking, not blindly, not recklessly, but in the way you trust when someone has been kind to you for 4 years and calls you dad and brings wine on a Tuesday. You stop checking. You assume the foundation is solid because nobody has knocked on it recently. I had worn that watch for 11 days. 11 days of conversations about my health, my property, my retirement, my marriage. 11 days of handing someone a blueprint of my life without knowing I was doing it. What Theo did was wrong. That's not complicated. He used a gift to build a case against the person who received it. He shaped private words into evidence of decline. He made phone calls in my name to institutions that held my savings. There is a word for the kind of intelligence it takes to construct that, and the word is not clever, it is calculating. And calculation without conscience eventually collapses under its own weight, because it requires you to keep building the lie, and the lie keeps needing more material. What Beb did was simple. She looked closer, that's all. She had the knowledge to recognize something wrong, and she had the integrity to say so quietly, without drama, without making me feel foolish for not seeing it myself. I've thought about that a great deal, about how much of the damage in this world is prevented, not by heroes, but by people who are simply paying attention and willing to say the uncomfortable thing to someone they respect. And what I did, once I understood what was happening, was refuse to panic. That was the hardest discipline I've ever applied. Not the bravest thing, just the most necessary. Every instinct I had said to confront, to accuse, to demand, I had to override that again and again for days, while I documented and verified and let the picture fill in completely. That kind of patience costs something. It costs pride, mostly, but it was the only thing that made the outcome real rather than just loud. I think about what my father used to say about the difference between strength and force. Force is what you use when you've run out of options. Strength is what lets you stay quiet long enough to have better ones. I'm not a philosopher. I'm a building inspector from Sudbury who almost had his life signed away in a second-bedroom filing cabinet. But I learned something at 63 that I wish I'd understood at 30. The people who mean you harm rarely look like they mean you harm. They look like someone who calls you dad. Pay attention. Trust carefully. And when something feels off, say so out loud, even if you can't yet explain why. That instinct is not weakness. It is the most honest intelligence you have.